Scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Well, we live near New York City, and there's a lot of really famous folks here. If you're in LA, you might run into somebody famous. Now, here's a thing about me. I'm terrible at spotting them. Okay, so, you ever with somebody and they go, "I think it's so-and-so," and it's like, I have no idea. I outside of their normal habitat, I do not understand these folks. So I saw this picture online, and I had to look at the caption to recognize who it was. How many of you look at this and know exactly who that is? A few people? Okay. All right, so it's Brad Pitt. All right. Now, if I saw Brad Pitt dressed like that on the street next to me, we could be in the same elevator, I would have no clue. Someone would have to come up to me and go, "Do you know you were standing next to Brad Pitt?" And then I would say, "I had no idea." I would have asked him, what was he thinking when he dumped Jennifer Aniston? What was going on with that? Okay, I have no clue. Because sometimes it can be hard to see extraordinary things outside of their context. And so sometimes we just don't recognize the extraordinary in the ordinary. So you're just going about your business, you're on an elevator or in a line at the supermarket or whatever, and we just take things for granted. We don't understand just how extraordinary ordinary things can be. I mean, you think about your morning cup of coffee, and you think about how many people, how many hands it took to grow that cup and to get the beans here, and all the effort and labor that went into creating that one luscious, life-giving cup of coffee that makes it worth it to get up in the morning, okay? We often just don't recognize how extraordinary those things are. And the failure to recognize the extraordinary in the ordinary is really central to this passage. You have these two disciples. Now, these two disciples, who were they? They're not mentioned anywhere else. In fact, in this story, only one of them is given a name. They are not among the 12. But if you remember certain gospel stories like the sending of the 70, okay, it's widely believed that they were at that level. So Jesus at one point sends 70 persons out, and it includes the 12. And so we sort of presume that these two, who were close enough to the 12, actually now 11 at this point in the story, since Judas is gone, that they're close enough to them to understand the Easter story from their perspective, to know of it. However, they weren't in that locked room with them, the story that we had last week, okay? So we presume that these were in that next level of followers, in that level of the 70, not the level of the 12. And they have no idea that this person who came up to them on the road is Jesus. And Jesus approaches them in the most ordinary way. All right, he comes up and he says, "What are you discussing with each other?" And it said that they had been talking about those Easter Sunday events. But the way Jesus talks to them, it's really casual. If you actually look at this phrase in the Greek, what it actually says is, "What words are you throwing to each other?" So this is kind of like someone coming up to you. You ever had this, right? You're in a conversation with somebody, and maybe it's even about something serious, and someone comes up to you and just goes, "What you talking about? What you talking about?" That's that level of informality and familiarity that Jesus has in this passage. So they're coming along the road. They're talking about the resurrection reports from the women of the 12, and Jesus just comes up behind them and says, "What you talking about?" Which actually could even be annoying when you're talking about something important. And so finally, one of them answers Jesus and says, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place? What do you mean, what are we talking about?" It was really significant. It was really important. And you must be the only person in the area who has no idea that this took place. And so they recount the story to Jesus. They go, some women of our group astounded us. And when they did not find his body there, they came back. They told us they'd seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. And so in the way they describe it to Jesus, there's no sense of disbelief. There's no sense that they are writing this off. Every indicator in the way they speak to Jesus is that they believe this story. Right? They believe the women. They believe that the body isn't there. They believe Jesus rose, and that actually makes their behavior a little perplexing. They were followers of Jesus. They believed he was raised. So where were they going? Right? And this is actually a question that a lot of us can ask ourselves about our own lives. That if we claim to be a follower of Jesus, if we claim to be someone who believes the Easter story, what do your actions say about that belief? What do your actions actually say about whether you truly believe the story? So what was going on with these two? What were they doing, and where were they going? It doesn't actually say, but there's a strong implication in the text. So it begins by saying that they're going to Emmaus, which is 7 miles away. All right, insignificant town, never gets mentioned anywhere else. And then when they get there, Jesus moves on, and it says that the two of them urge Jesus, "Stay with us." That's the clue. What was Emmaus? It was really simple. They were going home. So after all this, after following Jesus, going from town to town, participating in his ministry, the 11 stayed in Jerusalem. And you can imagine that maybe they did because at other points in the Gospels, some of the 11 say things to Jesus like, "We've left everything. We have nowhere else to go." So maybe the 11 are there because they don't have anywhere else to be. And they're staying in that locked room out of fear. But these two, they apparently could go home. And that's apparently where they were going. And so despite the fact that they had been a follower, despite the fact that they had witnessed all the things that Jesus did, despite the fact that they believed the account that Jesus was raised and the angels had appeared to the women, all of that happened, and their response was to just go home. Now, why would they do that? Well, in the way they talk about their experience, there's an answer. It says, we had hoped. Past tense. We had hoped. When they were with Jesus, they were hoping. All right? Now, what were they hoping for? They were hoping for Jesus to do what they thought Jesus was going to do. We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. And then they believed that Jesus had risen. They believed, though, that Jesus was gone. So they thought Jesus left. They thought Jesus was going to come as the Messiah and overthrow Roman rule and do all those things. And now he was raised, the body wasn't there, and hope was something in past tense for them. Because they thought he left. Now, why would they think that? There are a few pretty obvious reasons. Maybe they figured he was just mad. I mean, after all, if I showed up, put yourself in Jesus' shoes. You show up, you do a bunch of healing, you give a good message, you supply loaves and fishes, and what do? They crucify you. What would your reaction be? Well, I'm done with these people. Look at what I did, and I'm done, So that would be kind of a natural supposition for them to think that Jesus came, they mistreated him to the max, and so when he was resurrected, he just said, see ya, I'm out of here. All right. Maybe they thought that Jesus decided that they weren't worthy of him because they didn't do what he said they should do. Maybe they thought that Jesus' ministry was a test of some kind and that somehow they had failed the test. And sometimes we can think that about ourselves. Sometimes we can think that somehow Jesus had expectations of us and that we failed Jesus in those expectations, and that the result of our failure is that Jesus left. That Jesus was no longer with us. That Jesus was no longer caring about us because somehow, some way, along the way, we had failed Jesus. So Jesus chose to no longer act on our behalf. So one of the questions is, are you a believer who's lost hope? Are you someone who, in your head, believes the story, that in your head you believe the accounts, that you believe that Jesus died for you, you believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, that somehow you accept these teachings of the church, and yet somehow Jesus has left your life, and that somehow Jesus doesn't care? Okay. Have you stopped seeing Jesus in your life? See, it's easy for us to believe that somehow Jesus has things that are too small for Jesus to care about. Okay. And that can be a real problem. But instead, what happens is Jesus sits at dinner with them. He stays with them. And in the very ordinary act of a meal, he breaks the bread. He gives thanks, which is not an extraordinary thing to do, but a very ordinary thing to do. He breaks the bread, he blesses it, he gives it to them, and then they realize that he's there. And it was important that Jesus make sure that he was recognized in the ordinary. See, the key to this story, all right, is that sure, we can see the actions of God in the miraculous. We can see the action of God in the extraordinary. But it was really important for us to recognize Jesus in the ordinary. It was important for them to see that Jesus was there in the ordinary. Otherwise, we risk reducing God to being only a God who's only there, who's only with us, who's only acting in the big, miraculous ways and not in the ordinary ways. And if we're not careful, we can start to believe that the absence of the miraculous is the absence of God. But that's not the case. See, even in confirmation class every year, one of the things we talk about with the confirmands is, can you see God in the ordinary? Can you experience God in ordinary interactions? It's an important thing for students to understand, to start to incorporate that into the way they see the world, so that they understand that you don't have to only see God in the big, that you don't have to only see God in the big, fantastic, extraordinary miracle, but that you see God in the everyday. Like I mentioned this, and people laugh, and you probably will again, that I pray for parking spaces. Okay. Now, I generally only do it when it's church-related, primarily. Like I've mentioned this, it's primarily if we have a parishioner who's in the hospital in the city, I pray for a parking space. Okay, so I can visit them. And I've said this, and this is absolutely true, God has never failed to provide me a parking space. However, on certain days, God decides that I need exercise and puts that space further from the hospital than on other days. Okay. I also pray for good weather for church events. Okay, it's very important to me to pray for good weather for church events, and everyone, the staff especially, they know that I do this, I talk about it, I pray for it. Now, why is that important? Why is that actually important in my life? It's important in my life because I need the reminder that God is active in the little stuff. That God is active in the things that don't seem to be that important. All right. So I always remember, I turn to God. I can be at the ShopRite, I'm looking for an item that isn't of a category important enough to appear on the sign, over the aisle. And I can be looking for it, and I'll stop for a minute and go, I really need to find it. I'll actually stop for a second and pray, dear God, help me find it. Okay. Just lead me to where it is. Because I believe that God's there in the little stuff. I've mentioned a few times also one of my favorite old sitcoms that I'll watch over and over is How I Met Your Mother. All right. And there was a scene in one of the episodes where two of the characters had just had a baby. And then after they have a baby, they're talking about how important it is that their energy is focused on the baby. So they tell the rest of their friends that they can't bother them anymore with their personal problems. They go, unless it's an 8 or higher, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's got to be an 8 or higher. You're having a fight with your girlfriend? Sorry, that's not an 8 or higher, okay? And so they do that. But the upshot of that episode was at the end of it, what they come to realize is that in putting that standard there of don't talk to me unless it's an 8 or higher, they were being bad friends. They were being bad friends. You're not really someone's friend if you don't want them coming to you unless it's an 8 or higher. When you're a good friend to someone or someone is a good friend to you, it doesn't have to be an 8 or higher for them to talk to you about it. If it's a 2, you care because they're your friend. And if it's a 2, you'll talk to your friend about it because they're your friend. And we don't want to believe that we worship a God who says, don't pray to me unless it's an 8 or higher. No, that's not the kind of God we worship. That's not the kind of God we want to have a relationship with. We have a relationship with a God who says, I don't care if it's a 1, because I care about the ones. I care about the ones and the twos in your lives. I don't just care about the 8s and the 9s and the 10s. I care about everything in your life, no matter how small it is. If it's bothering you, it's bothering me because I am a God who loves you and cares about you. And you can come talk to me about it. And we understand that that's actually the basis of a good friendship. If you can talk to them about something small, you can talk to them about something big. If you can't talk to them about something small, why would you trust them with something big? And we know that principle everywhere, right? If you go into a restaurant and the bathrooms are messy, you wonder if the kitchen is clean. Because attention to the little things is how you show that there's attention to the big things. And we understand that God is there in the little things. And that's how we know that God is there in the big things. But as human beings, we often have a tendency to only want to see God in the extraordinary, to only want to see God in the unusual. And so we do things like you have the 4-leaf clover, and we say that that's lucky. We ascribe meaning to the 4-leaf clover because it's unusual. But people of faith find meaning in the wonder of the 3-leaf clover. You know, when we're out there yesterday planting the stuff that Felicia was talking about, you just think about that and you look at it and you think, this is amazing. It's actually amazing. Right? You put a plant in the ground, just what it takes for a plant to grow is amazing. You look at that clover and you see the way it's formed and you see how the roots work and you see how the leaves form, the whole idea of photosynthesis, all these things, they're absolutely amazing. And when you see God in the ordinary, you never stop seeing God around you. And that's why it's so important to see God in the ordinary. Right? See, the 2 disciples on the road come to realize this. When after Jesus has left, they go, weren't our hearts burning within us? See, too often we ignore it. Too often there actually is a little sense inside of us, a little thing burning within us that says, this is wondrous, but we ignore it. They realized after the fact that they had taken the presence of Jesus for granted, the same way we often take people for granted in our lives. People are there and we don't appreciate what they bring to our lives. We don't appreciate how important it is that they are there with us. But the 2 realized that Jesus was with them all along. And this realization was not just important as a thought process. Because had they understood that Jesus was with them all along, the impact of it on them would have been different. Because what happened when they realized that Jesus had been with them? They returned to Jerusalem. They had been going home. And now they're back in Jerusalem. They're back in Jerusalem when they realized that Jesus had not left, that Jesus was still with them, that Jesus was there. And you'll notice Jesus didn't say, go back. He didn't greet them and say, hey, you need to go back with the others. What are you doing here? He didn't say anything to them. Right? In fact, did you notice what happened when they realized that Jesus was there? It said this. They recognized him and he vanished. They recognized him and he was gone again. It was yet another miraculous disappearance, but now they knew that just because they couldn't see him, it didn't mean he was gone. See, at first, when the women reported that the tomb was empty and he had risen, they thought that because they couldn't see him, he was gone. And now they understand that just because they don't see him, it doesn't mean that he's gone. He's still there. They may not be able to see him, but he hadn't left them. And that was such a critical difference. And it's a critical difference that they understood that and they took that understanding, so they put themselves back in Jerusalem. They put themselves back on mission because they had understood that the mission continued because Jesus was still there. And so a reminder for us is a pretty simple statement that Jesus is with you always. And it is too easy for that statement to become a simple platitude. And maybe that's a platitude that some of you need to hear. It depends on where you are in your life right now. You might be in a place where you believe that Jesus has abandoned you, where you believe that somehow Jesus is not there for you. And if you are in that place, then what you need is that simple moment of comfort, that simple reminder that no, you have not been abandoned, no, you have not been forgotten, no, you are not someone whom Jesus has stopped caring about. You need to remember that Jesus is with you always, and Jesus has never stopped caring. For some of you, that's the message you need to hear. But for all of us, it's also a call to action. It's a call to not just be the two who are on their way home after Jesus was raised, but rather the two who went back to Jerusalem to resume the mission. Because the knowledge that Jesus is with you always is a reminder not to simply go on with your life as normal, as if Jesus was not a part of it, but to keep going and pursuing the mission of God. Because when we are on mission, we're on mission in, again, so many ordinary ways. What's our mission as followers of Jesus? It's to go out into the world and spread love. To go out in the world and spread compassion. To go out in the world and spread kindness. To go out in the world and remind people that they too are loved by God and cared for by God and seen as unique individuals who are all children of God. And when we do that, we are often the person who is giving them an experience of God in the ordinary. You know, that little extra act of kindness that you don't have to do, but you do for someone, a stranger, someone you've never met before, someone you'll never see again. Maybe for them, that little act becomes the moment where that day they were reminded that God was with them in the ordinary parts of their lives. Right? It can be something so simple. It can be the extra kindness of holding a door open for someone. It can be the extra kindness of seeing someone struggle loading a big box into their car and you stop and help them. And then they think in that moment, oh my gosh, that person came along at just the right time to help me do that. And it wasn't life-changing, it wasn't life-shattering, but it was just that little moment that maybe reminds them, wow, they were right there at the right time to do a kind thing. That was God. And then it spreads because it becomes a reminder to them that God is omnipresent in their lives, that God was also there in the parking lot when they were struggling with the heavy box, that God was also there when they needed somebody to give a kind word to them because they were feeling down. You can be the person who brings the love of God, the presence of God into someone's life in what is otherwise a very ordinary moment. And then we end up growing the mission that way. That everyone hopefully begins to see on an ever greater basis that Jesus is in fact with them always, in every little thing, in every little moment, in every little struggle, in every little joy. Jesus is with you. So I hope that you'll look for God not in the extraordinary, but in the ordinary, in the middle of the everyday. Because I assure you, God has never left, and God's always there for you. Amen.